Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14. Today, we'll be wrapping up the regular season here in year number 3, going through the final 3 weeks before Conference Championship weekend. It really comes down to it right here. This is going to be the last chance for a lot of teams and players to prove themselves to the College Football Playoff Committee, along with the Awards Committee as well. So we're really going to see some teams finalize their resumes today as they look to get a spot in the College Football Playoff, and certain players look to win big-time awards. At the end of the last episode, I talked about how this episode right here is going to be so important, and there are so many big-time games that I'm excited to go over. In the last episode, we went through weeks 10, 11, and 12. Week 11 was certainly the biggest of the group. We had a lot of big-time teams lose, like Notre Dame, Miami, Oklahoma. That was certainly a surprise. And there were some other ones as well. Georgia barely won. Texas barely won. Alabama barely won. And then week 12 was pretty exciting as well. So as we go into these last 3 weeks, I think the most important one is week 13 right off the bat. There are like 5 really good games that are going to be super important for the college football playoff landscape. Obviously, week 14, rivalry week, that's going to be really exciting as well. And then week 15, there aren't as many games, but there are some good ones, specifically Army and Navy. So this is what the polls look like here going into week 13. And as you can see towards the right part of your screen, a lot of these teams are facing off against ranked opponents. Again, there are like 5 really big-time games that I'm excited to go over this week, and that will essentially make or break this entire season. Currently, the Heisman watch seems to be as close as it's ever been. Ernie Capellar of Florida is currently in first place. Aaron Ketchikan from Georgia has been the favorite for most of the year, and he has dropped all the way to 4th, kind of out of nowhere. We've also started to see some of the big-time awards finalists, and again, you guys at home will be able to vote for the awards along with the college football playoff once we get through the regular season and all of the conference championship games, which will be in the next episode. Before we get started, I do want to take a quick look at each conference just to sort of give an update on where each conference championship race is currently at. If you would rather skip right to the games, I'll put a timestamp in the description and you'll be able to do that. So as I've been saying throughout pretty much the entire season, the ACC, the Big Ten, and the SEC are by far the 3 best conferences in the country, and I would be very surprised if there is an at-large bid into the college football playoff not from one of these 3 conferences. Let's start with the SEC, where the picture is pretty clear. Florida has already won the SEC East. They, no matter what, are going to the conference championship, meaning a team like Georgia cannot advance to the conference championship. So the only way Georgia gets into the playoff is with an at-large bid, which I think there's a good shot they would get if they would win out. As for the West, Oklahoma plays against Alabama this week. The winner goes to the conference championship, guaranteed, and the loser would have to get in with an at-large bid. And I think Texas could be an interesting team to watch for an at-large spot as well. But for the conference championship game itself, Florida will play against the winner of Alabama and Oklahoma, which is this coming week. As for the ACC, I think it's a little bit more chaotic. There's a lot more going on in this conference because there are 5 really good teams. In the Atlantic, Navy controls their own destiny here, and it's ironic because Florida State plays against Clemson this upcoming week. Chances are neither of those teams will make the ACC championship, but both of them have a big opportunity to get an at-large bid into the college football playoff, so that is a huge game, and both Clemson and Florida State have really tough games the following week. But Navy is the one who's probably going to make the conference championship game, assuming they beat Maryland in week 14, and Maryland's pretty bad. As for the Coastal Division, it's a lot more clear. Miami's out of the race. It's down to Virginia Tech and Duke. They play against each other this week in week 13. If Virginia Tech wins, they are going to the conference championship. If Duke wins, they are probably going to the conference championship. And really, these top 5 teams all have a very real shot at making the playoff. As for the Big Ten, Ohio State is practically in the conference championship, but they have not officially clinched yet. They play against Illinois this week, and the Fighting Illini have been red hot. They are now the 19th ranked team in the country. So Illinois pretty much has to win this game if they want any chance of making the playoff, but they've been playing some good football lately, and that's going to be a tough one for the Buckeyes. Ohio State then plays against Michigan in Week 14. As for the Big Ten West, Oregon cannot make the conference championship, but I think Oregon's in a really good spot. They only have one more game left against Oregon State. If they win that, they'll be 10-2. They'll have no conference championship game to worry about, and they'll probably make the playoff. Chances are it'll be the winner of USC and Notre Dame in Week 14 who makes the conference championship. And I think the loser of that game is pretty much out of playoff contention. So that is a massive game in Week 14 between a couple of big-time rivals. I would rather be in Oregon's spot, who's probably not going to make the conference championship. As for the Big 12, it's probably going to be Cincinnati and Baylor. Neither of them have officially clinched, but they both can do so this week in Week 13. And then in the Pac-12, Cal has already clinched. And then in the North, you've got Washington going up against Arizona this upcoming week. The winner will clinch the division and go to the Pac-12 championship against the Cal Golden Bears. Cal is the only team in the entire country, other than Middle Tennessee State, who has not lost to an FBS opponent yet this year. The Golden Bears are 9-1 and playing some great football on the year. As for the Group 5 conferences, we'll start with the American because chances are Middle Tennessee State will be the Group 5 team who automatically goes into the college football playoff. They beat South Florida and Memphis in the last episode, so they should have an easy road to 12-0. They'll go up against one of these top 4 teams in the West. It really could be any of them. I have no clue who Middle Tennessee State will play in the conference championship. The Conference USA does not have a conference championship, but chances are Tulsa will win that conference. In the MAC, Bowling Green controls their own fate. And then in the West, we've got a pretty close race between a lot of the top teams there. Idaho is in a good spot in the Mountain West. Again, no conference championship game, however. And then in the Sun Belt, also, there's no conference championship game in that conference. So let's take a look at the slate of games here for the final 3 weeks of the regular season. As I said, Week 13, there are some massive matchups. Virginia Tech and Duke. The winner probably wins the Coastal Division and goes to the conference championship. This is one of the biggest games of Heisman contending quarterback Justin Tucker's collegiate career. Illinois and Ohio State. If Ohio State wins, they're going to the conference championship. Illinois has to win to pretty much keep their playoff hopes alive. The winner of Arizona and Washington goes to the Pac-12 championship to go up against Cal. And then during the late slate, Clemson plays against Florida State. Chances are neither of these teams will go to their conference championship, but this is a huge game for getting an at-large bid into the college football playoff. And then Oklahoma and Alabama, the winner clinches the SEC West and will play against Florida in the conference championship. In Week 14, the biggest game of the bunch is Notre Dame and USC. The winner will clinch the Big Ten West most likely and go to the conference championship. Florida and Florida State is also a huge game, particularly for the Seminoles who want to prove themselves within the college football playoff race. And then a lot of these other big-time teams have must-win games, including Navy. And then Week 15, it's a pretty small slate. The only teams who are really contending for a playoff spot playing in this week are Navy and Oklahoma. So we'll start with Week 13, and we'll start off with a bang. If Virginia Tech wins, they are going to the ACC championship game. And if Duke wins, then they are probably going to the ACC championship game. If you factor in what was at stake, along with how good this game ended up being, this was the greatest regular season game in the history of this series. So buckle up, folks. Duke is getting around 68% of the pick'em vote. Let's get started on what ended up being an instant classic of a football game. The first quarter started off a little bit slowly. Both teams traded off touchdowns, and it was tied at 7-1. So not a ton of action early, but it was pretty clear to everybody in this stadium that this game was going to get good quick. Virginia Tech took control early in the second quarter as they scored a pair of touchdowns to take a 21-7 lead. Quarterback DeAndre Jones has already ran for 2 scores, and he's thrown for 1 right here to his number 1 wide receiver, Marcus Barnes. Duke would respond late with a big rushing touchdown by Justin Tucker to make it 21-14 going into halftime. That would bring us into the third quarter, and Virginia Tech would pick up right where they left off. as Jones would connect with Marcus Barnes once again to put Virginia Tech back up by 14. Duke would quickly respond, however. Running back Tyler Garbarant would score twice in this quarter, and after 3, we would be all knotted up at 28 with 1 quarter to go. That's when things really got crazy. So Virginia Tech got the ball early in the 4th quarter. They would kick a field goal. They're up by 3. Duke would get it back, drive down the field, and they would score a touchdown with this miraculous throw by Justin Tucker into the hands of wide receiver David Odorat. Virginia Tech would get it back. They would have to kick another field goal, so Duke still leads 35-34. The Blue Devils would get it back, and Justin Tucker would find the end zone once more to put Duke ahead by 8 with about 2 minutes left on the clock. And now it's time for Virginia Tech quarterback DeAndre Jones to drive his team down the field and look to tie the game. Virginia Tech appears to be moving it well off of a very suspect Duke defense. And with under 30 seconds to go, Jones would connect here with Porter for a game-tying touchdown. But Virginia Tech still trails by 2. They've got to get the 2-point conversion, and running back Edgar Frazier would punch it in. We're tied at 42, going to overtime. Duke would get the ball first, and they would get right to work with a quick touchdown to take a 7-point lead. Virginia Tech would get the ball back. They would respond. So we are now tied at 49, going into a double overtime. Virginia Tech would start with the ball, and they would score once more. So the Hokies are now up 56-49, meaning Justin Tucker's got to get the biggest drive of his career. And on the very first play of the drive, they would score. So that's David Odorat once again, meaning we are going to a triple overtime. On 3rd down, Justin Tucker would be sacked, forcing Duke to kick a field goal. The kick would be up and good. So the Blue Devils are now up by 3 points. Virginia Tech would get it back. DeAndre Jones on a 3rd down would look for the end zone. His pass would be tipped and intercepted. Duke wins it in triple overtime, 56-59. Yeah, I think it's fair to say this game was as good as advertised. And with that, Duke controls their own fate. If they beat North Carolina next week, or if Virginia Tech loses to Virginia, Duke is going to the ACC championship game. Justin Tucker was honestly kind of mediocre for his standards. He was obviously fantastic, but compared to some of his other games, his numbers weren't that impressive. As for Virginia Tech, their offense played great, their defense not so much. I think Virginia Tech showed today that they can hang with the best and they belong in the college football playoff discussion. Let's now head to the shoe as Illinois faces off against the Ohio State University. With a win, the Buckeyes are in the Big Ten championship game for a 2nd straight season. And with a loss, Illinois' Cinderella run at the college football playoff looks like it would be just about dead. The Pick'em very much sided with Ohio State, who garnered around 90% of the vote. So this game did not end up being quite as good as the first one. Illinois would get the ball first. They would drive down the field with an awesome touchdown pass from Derek Watson into the hands of Tyler Kane. And from there, it went downhill and downhill fast. So Illinois scored on the first drive of the game, and then after that, Ohio State basically said, hey, thanks for playing. It's now time for us to dominate, and dominate they did. Quarterback Puma Whitlock had a Heisman-esque performance for the Buckeyes, and they would end up winning in dominant fashion, 59-21. Much of the Heisman discussion this year has been on guys like Ernie Capellar, Justin Tucker, and Aaron Ketchikan, and deservedly so. But I think Ohio State quarterback Puma Whitlock has put himself well within that conversation of the top 4 to 5 Heisman contenders in the country with a dominant performance here against the University of Illinois. And with that, Ohio State is going back to the conference championship game. Puma Whitlock was a total monster today with 370 yards and 5 touchdowns. I really think he is the best quarterback prospect in college football. As for Illinois, great season, but I don't think they're going to be able to get to the college football playoff now. Next up, we had the Pac-12 North Championship game, essentially, between Arizona and Washington. Why Arizona is in the North Division, I honestly don't know. It seems like the slight majority of the pick'em is going with Washington, who played against Cal last year in the conference championship game, so we'll see if we get a rematch or if it'll be Arizona. This game ended up being in the snow, and this game ended up being a good one. Both offenses played very well, especially early. Arizona quarterback Kareem Kamara was able to do his thing, continuing to cement himself as one of the top 4 or 5 quarterbacks off the board in this year's draft. But Washington's pass game was very good as well. In the second half, it was much of the same. Despite the weather conditions, both offenses were great. This incredible touchdown by Walker Charleston, the possible first tight end off the board in this year's draft, would put Arizona ahead. And the Wildcats looked like they were in a pretty good spot going into the fourth quarter. But as Arizona has done throughout this entire series, right when you think they're about to win a big game, they don't. Washington would end up coming back from behind with 2 late rushing touchdowns from quarterback Kai Suggs-Gardner to propel the Huskies to the win 34-37. And for a second straight year, Washington and Cal will play against each other in the conference championship game. As for Arizona, their playoff chances are now down the toilet. Another season where Arizona was so close, yet so far. Number 1, Middle Tennessee State facing off against Southern Miss. The Blue Raiders are the only undefeated team in the country, and everybody expected this game to be another blowout, and it sure was. But not the blowout that we expected. Southern Mississippi dominated the Blue Raiders today, winning this game 37-14. That's just the second time in this entire series that Middle Tennessee State has lost a regular season game. Middle Tennessee State still has a big opportunity to make the college football playoff, but a lot of their weaknesses were exposed on both sides of the ball. As for Southern Miss, what a huge upset. They are now ranked. I don't really know why, because they're 6-5 and they're in a Group 5 conference. Big win, but they should not be ranked over a team like Idaho. The Vandals are 10-1. This is their final game of the regular season at the classic Kibbe Dome against the struggling San Jose State Spartans. Idaho went in and dominated without their number 1 receiver, Colin Robinson. Stepping up as the number 1 receiver was sophomore Soup El Capitan, who scored 2 touchdowns and racked up over 80 yards. Idaho would win this game big and finish their season 11-1. I didn't talk about this game specifically for the game itself. It's not really a surprise that Idaho won, but I wanted to talk about Idaho here for their final regular season game because they had a great season. They absolutely should be in the top 25. I don't think their resume is that impressive. They haven't really beaten anybody good, but they're 11-1. So shout out to the Vandals on a great season within the Mountain West. Number 17, Texas wraps up their regular season today here against Ole Miss. Texas has to win to stay in playoff contention, and Ole Miss is not a very good team. So Texas should be able to win this game. Will we have Texas fall on their face, or is Texas actually back? And shockingly, it was the latter. Texas took care of business today, dominating the Ole Miss Rebels by the score of 30-3. Texas has won their final 7 consecutive games and finishes 9-3. Texas still is an uphill battle to face. They still need a few teams to really fall, but Texas has a case to get an at-large bid into the college football playoff. It's unlikely, but it's certainly possible. Could we see Texas in the playoff this year? Well, we won't be seeing Ole Miss because they suck. They are now 4-7, another rough season in Oxford, Mississippi. Let's get to our final 2 games of the week, and both of them are big ones. We start with Clemson and Florida State. Chances are neither of these teams will go to the ACC championship game, but this is still a huge matchup for college football playoff implications, as both of these teams have a great shot at getting an at-large bid. I think this is a must-win game for Florida State. If they lose, they will have had 3 losses, and they have to play against Florida next week. This game also ended up being really good. These are probably the 2 best teams in the ACC on paper, even though they're not going to make the conference championship. I'm not convinced Navy, Virginia Tech, or Duke is better than either of these 2 teams in a per-talent basis. Clemson quarterback Cedric Chapman was dynamic per usual. He's not a great passer, but he is probably the best rushing quarterback in the country. However, it was Florida State who led big late. The Seminoles were up by 10, 31-21 after this touchdown with about 5 minutes to go. Clemson would have to march down the field quickly and score a touchdown, which they would, cutting the lead to 3. Clemson's now got to get this onside kick, and it is picked up by the Seminoles. Florida State wins it 31-28, a massive shakeup in the college football playoff landscape. Florida State the past couple of seasons has been so close to making the playoff, but they've lost big games at the end of the season. Jacob King had the best performance of his collegiate career. When he needed to show up, he showed up. Hats off to the Seminoles on a big win. As for Clemson, there's still a good shot that they'll get in. I think had they won today, they could have pretty much confirmed it. Now they can't, but they're still in a good spot. And finally, we wrap up with Oklahoma headed down to Tuscaloosa to face off against Alabama. The winner of this game clinches the SEC West and goes to the conference championship. The pick'em vote ended up being very close, with Oklahoma getting a little bit over 50% of the votes, despite being ranked lower and having a worse record. This game also ended up being pretty good. Possible number 1 overall draft pick Romeo Colucci had another very good performance in this one, per usual. Him and Justin Tucker are having an unbelievable battle for the QB1 in this year's draft class, because both players have been nothing short of spectacular. Alabama's offense was just as good. Sophomore quarterback Troy Davenport played pretty well. The number 1 receiver Khalil Hassan made plays. Alabama, per usual, ran the ball pretty well. They're one of the best rushing attacks in the country. I think both of these teams are absolutely good enough to get an at-large bid into the college football playoff, but both teams want to control their own destiny. They want to get into the SEC championship, have an opportunity to play against Florida, and earn that spot themselves. And this game ended up going down to the wire between two of the most talented teams in the country. But ultimately, to my surprise, it was Alabama who knocked off the Sooners, which means Florida and Alabama will go to the conference championship game, 35-28 being your final score. I just have had a lack of trust in Alabama this year, but they keep winning games. They have not lost since week 2 and are now the number 1 team in the country. Romeo Colucci was excellent. Not his fault Oklahoma lost, but now the Sooners have 3 losses. So does that get them an at-large bid? I don't know. They might have pushed themselves out. Looking at some of the other scores, teams like Baylor, Notre Dame, and USC, who all had to win, end up winning. Michigan State and Bowling Green are now ranked. South Alabama drops 47 on the poor Kansas Jayhawks. USF beats Memphis. Georgia drops 51 on Kentucky. So if the Bulldogs win next week, they will finish 10-2. They'll be in a good spot. Southern Miss and Cal with nice wins as well. Cincinnati lost to Iowa State. This makes the Big 12 race a little bit more fascinating. Cincinnati could have clinched their division today. They can still do so with a win against BYU next week, and BYU stinks. Pitt finishes their season with a loss to Texas Tech. Still a pretty solid season for Pitt. Can't really say the same about Rutgers, who finishes their year 1-11. Yeah, they really missed Dior Antoine. Last year they were getting college football playoff votes, and now they have 11 losses. Speaking of teams in the playoff last year, Nebraska, they will officially finish under 500 as they fall to 4-7 with a loss against the Wisconsin Badgers. Houston, another playoff team from last year, also guaranteed to finish under 500, although they did win today. Penn State beats up on Purdue. I said Purdue was going to be pretty good this year, and I could not have been more wrong. Purdue has been arguably the worst Power 5 team in the country. Central Michigan keeps on losing. Another team who was getting votes for the playoff last year. Now they're up to 5 losses. Rice dropped 66 on Tulane. Their quarterback, Johnny Woodman, threw for 7 touchdowns. Oregon State upsets Tennessee. Boise State finishes their year 500. UAB beats the now 2-9 SMU Mustangs. Remember, SMU made the conference championship game last year. Any small chance Miami had of making the playoff is now toast as they lose to Georgia Tech. And that is about it. So, I said this was going to be the biggest regular season week in the history of this series, and boy did it not disappoint. There were some big games. We've got a new number 1 team. It's the Alabama Crimson Tide, who jump Florida, and Middle Tennessee State jumps all the way to 10. Notable risers include Duke and Florida State, who are now in the top 8. Clemson falls to 9. Oklahoma falls to 15 with 3 losses now. Michigan State, Bowling Green, Mississippi State, and Southern Miss are now ranked, with South Carolina, Tennessee, and some other teams dropping out. We have a new favorite for the Heisman Watch, and it's Justin Tucker, only about 8 weeks too late, but it has happened. Aram Katchakan and Puma Whitlock are now in the top 3, with Capilar falling to 4. As for your players of the week, on defense, it's corner Chris Moore, and on offense, quarterback Lyndon Kirkstead of Penn State wins it for a second consecutive week. So that'll bring us into week 14. For most teams, this is the final regular season game. Around 90% of the teams in the country do not have a game in week 15. So for most teams, this is it. For everybody competing in the college football playoff, this is your last chance to prove yourself unless you're going to a conference championship game. So for teams like Oregon and Georgia, this is it. Notre Dame and USC, this is the biggest game of the week. The winner officially wins the Big Ten West and will play Ohio State in the conference championship game. And again, looking at more teams who have to win going down the board a little bit further. Florida State, if they beat Florida, I think the Seminoles are probably going to the playoff pretty much no matter what. That would be a massive statement win for them at the end of the season. And then looking down even further, teams like Alabama and Florida are playing for seeding purposes. Middle Tennessee State's got to right the ship. Clemson cannot afford to lose another game. If Duke wins, they're going to the conference championship. And if Navy wins, they're going to the conference championship as well. We'll start with Cincinnati, another team who is in a win-and-in scenario. If Cincinnati wins, they will go to the Big 12 championship, and if they lose, then they're going to need to rely on Iowa State to lose to West Virginia. Well, Cincinnati was able to put fate in their own hands, and they would get the win on the road, 45-28. So with that, it is official. Cincinnati will be playing against Baylor in the Big 12 championship game. The winner will go to the college football playoff, and the loser probably will not. Those automatic bids for winning conference championships are so important, so hats off to Cincinnati for getting here. They kind of made it a little bit too close at the end, losing last week to Iowa State, but they got the job done today. For Oregon, this is the final game of the season for them. They will not play in the conference championship. Their last opportunity to prove to the playoff committee why they belong is right now in the snow against Oregon State. Obviously, this is a rivalry game, so you'd think it's going to be a little bit closer than people expect, and that ended up being the case, but ultimately the Ducks would take care of business. Oregon finishes 10-2. They don't have the conference championship game to worry about, and I think the Ducks absolutely have a deserving resume to enter the college football playoff. So with that, I think there's a really good shot we'll be seeing the Ducks in the playoff, but ultimately it is up to you guys because you will be voting for the college football playoff, but I do think Oregon is in a very good spot to grab one of those at-large bids. Georgia is in the same exact boat as Oregon. This is their last game of the year. They're not going to their conference championship game, and if they win, they'll improve to 10-2, and they'll be in a really good spot. Unlike the Oregon game, this was a total blowout. Heisman contending quarterback Aram Kachakan reminded people on why he is a Heisman contender, and he absolutely dominated. Georgia would win big against a pretty good Georgia Tech team, 63-14. So with that, Georgia, just like Oregon, finishes 10-2. No conference championship game. They're in a good spot to get one of the voted in at-large bids. As for Georgia Tech, they were a lot better than they were last year. So overall, a positive season for the Yellow Jackets, who are going bowling. This is a must-win game for Virginia Tech for multiple reasons. One, if they win and Duke loses, then Virginia Tech goes to the ACC Championship. And along with that, Virginia Tech cannot afford another loss if they want to get an at-large bid into the playoffs. So they have to win this game or else they're probably out. And this game ended up being a little bit closer than it should have. But ultimately, the Hokies would take care of business against a pretty good Virginia team. Remember, Virginia beat Ohio State in the shoe earlier this year. Virginia Tech wins 24-17. So this means if Duke wins the ACC Coastal, they go to the conference championship. If Duke loses, then it'll be Virginia Tech going to the ACC championship. Next up, we've got Notre Dame and USC, the biggest game of the week. The pick'em seems to be siding with USC, getting 64.5% of the votes. The winner of this game goes to the Big Ten championship against Ohio State, and the loser is probably out of playoff contention. So this is a very important game for both sides, and this game ended up being really close. Both teams ran the ball really well. We know Notre Dame is great at doing that. Running back M.J. Hill is having himself another phenomenal season for the Fighting Irish. But ultimately, this game came down to which offense is more multi-dimensional. and that ended up being the USC Trojans. Scotty Kimbrell II had a pretty good game, connecting with true freshman Tay Devine for a big touchdown, and running back Monty Bradley was able to score a couple of times, propelling USC to the win. So that means it is official. We've got USC and Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. The winner goes to the college football playoff, and Notre Dame, on the other hand, is pretty much out of playoff contention now that they have 4 losses. So it does not look like the Irish will get back for a second consecutive season, as USC gets the better of them. Depending on how USC plays in the Big Ten championship, they can still get in with a loss, but if they get blown out, there's a good shot they do not get an at-large bid. If they play close, then maybe they do. Obviously, if they win, they'll get an automatic bid. The team USC is playing in the Big Ten championship is the Ohio State Buckeyes, who are 10-1, number 3 in the country, facing off against Michigan. The Wolverines have made the playoffs 2 years in a row, but this year they are not so good, and they were not so good today. Ohio State needed to win this game for seeding purposes, and they were able to do so. So I think unless Ohio State loses by 100 to USC, the Buckeyes are going to make the playoff no matter what, as they beat Michigan 48-16. Puma Whitlock played even better today than he did a week ago. I didn't know that was possible. He threw for 4 touchdowns, added 2 on the ground. He is really, really good. Ohio State has been my pick to win the national championship since the start of the season, and I am not going to waver on that. Michigan did not throw the ball well whatsoever. They finished with a disappointing record of 6-6. The winner of this game between Texas Tech and South Alabama could go to the American Conference Championship. I made this one of the pick'em games of the week over Florida and Florida State, and I don't really know why. But this game ended up being pretty good. Both offenses were really, really solid in this one, which is typical of a South Alabama game, I suppose. Despite a big effort from the Texas Tech Red Raider offense, it would be South Alabama who got the win and would finish the season 10-2. What a great season it has been for South Alabama. Obviously, in season 1, they were in the Sun Belt. They made it all the way to the College Football Playoff National Championship game. Last year, they moved into the American Athletic. Things didn't go so well. They only won 4 games. They didn't make a bowl game. But this year, they were really good. They went 10-2. However, they have still not clinched their division yet. They still need UAB to lose. If UAB wins, they will play Middle Tennessee State in the conference championship game and not South Alabama. So South Alabama certainly will be rooting against their in-state counterparts, who we're going to get to in a little bit. Speaking of the state of Alabama, we have the Iron Bowl between Alabama and Auburn. Alabama is playing for seeding purposes. They would certainly love to position themselves to where they can get the number 1 overall seed in the playoff, which I think there's a good shot they will get that if they beat Florida in the SEC championship. However, it was Auburn who started this game off really strong. Through 1, the Tigers led this game 21-0. Auburn was dominating. Auburn always plays Alabama really well in the Iron Bowl, and today was no different. After the first quarter, it was like a flip switched. The Crimson Tide woke up, and they got to work. Alabama would ultimately win their 11th straight game, finishing the regular season 11-1. I think if Alabama beats Florida in the conference championship game, then Alabama will be the number 1 overall seed in the college football playoff. Good effort from Auburn, but they finished the season with a record of 6-6. Kind of the disappointing campaign for the Tigers, who started off really well, but didn't play as well down the stretch. Troy Davenport was not all that good today, but Alabama did have 300-yard rushers. Next up, we got probably the biggest game of the week between number 2 Florida and number 8 Florida State. Florida State, if they win, they're probably going to make the playoff. If they lose, not as likely. Florida State would get the ball first, they would drive down the field and score a touchdown, and Florida after that would say thanks for playing. It's time to turn this game into a blowout. The Gators absolutely dominated. This was the annual Florida State late season collapse that we have all been waiting for, as Florida would dominate. They would win 49-21, and the Gators would jump Alabama in the poll. So this means in the SEC championship, we have number 1 Florida and number 2 Alabama. The winner will probably be the number 1 overall seed in the college football playoff when it's all said and done. Florida State's in an interesting spot. They're 9-3. They're kind of in like Oklahoma land of being right on the brink of making the playoffs, so it'll be interesting to see if they can sneak in. This game on its own is not very important for Cal. They've already clinched a spot in the conference championship. However, with a win, they would be the only team in the entire country to not lose to an FBS team during the regular season. And ultimately, Cal would get the job done, winning this game handedly, 51-21. So Cal, after starting their season by losing to an FCS opponent, goes on an 11-game win streak and positions themselves well to get back into the college football playoff, led by a 6-touchdown performance from backup quarterback Marquise Harris. Cal has a dilemma, however, going into the conference championship game. Their starting quarterback, Rufus Motley, is healthy. Rufus Motley led Cal to the playoff last year. He's the guy they've built their offense around. But Marquise Harris has done so well coming in as the backup, throwing 29 touchdowns and 1 interception. So it's an interesting dilemma that the Golden Bears have at their plate before the Pac-12 championship game against Washington. Let me know what you would do down below in the comments. Which quarterback would you start if you're Cal? Next up, we have the de facto MAC East championship game between Bowling Green and Akron. The winner will go to the MAC championship in Detroit to face off against one of Eastern Michigan, Toledo, or Northern Illinois. Akron gave Bowling Green everything they could bargain for, but ultimately the Falcons would win 31-29, disappointing all-time famous mascot Zippy the Kangaroo. So Bowling Green finishes the year 11-1, and let's say hypothetically real quick, what if Middle Tennessee State loses their conference championship game? Why is that relevant to Bowling Green? Well, the highest-ranked Group 5 conference champion makes the college football playoff. If Middle Tennessee State wins theirs, that'll be them. If they lose, could it be Bowling Green? The Falcons have a realistic path to the playoff. Who will Middle Tennessee State face in the conference championship? Well, we're about to find out right now. If UAB wins, it'll be them. If they lose, then it will be South Alabama. UAB has to face off against a really tough Rice team who scored 66 points just a week ago. UAB currently has the #1 scoring defense in the entire country, so I think it's fair to say that Rice will not drop 66. They actually only dropped 17. UAB would win it 38-17, and with that, it'll be UAB, not South Alabama, going to the American Conference Championship game. If UAB beats Middle Tennessee State, could they be the highest-ranked Group 5 conference champion, and could they make the college football playoff? Again, a very interesting dilemma. Number 9, Clemson lost a week ago against Florida State, and I think this is a must-win game for the Tigers. If they win, they'll probably go to the playoff. If they lose, they probably won't, so they kind of have to win. South Carolina's a pretty good team, but they lost last week to LSU, and LSU stinks. Well, Clemson is also named the Tigers. They don't exactly stink, but like LSU, they would beat South Carolina off of another really good performance from quarterback Cedric Chapman. So with that, the Tigers finished 10-2, finishing the season as the 7th-ranked team in the country. And I think Clemson's in a pretty good spot. They're not going to the conference championship game, most likely, because Navy has the tiebreaker over Clemson. So even if Navy loses, which we'll get to them in a second, even if Navy loses, they're still going regardless. Number 7, Duke faces off against the North Carolina Tar Heels. If Duke wins, they will represent the ACC Coastal in the conference championship game against Navy. And if they lose, then it'll be Virginia Tech. We got another Heisman-esque performance today from Justin Tucker, who continues to be nothing short of amazing. Duke scored 53 points in this game after dropping 59 a week ago. However, there's been one glaring problem about this Duke team all season, and that is their defense. And ultimately, that problem would end up catching up to them today. North Carolina would get the upset win here, beating Duke 58-53, really shaking things up in the college football playoff race. Duke will not go to the conference championship. Instead, it will be Virginia Tech. Duke finishes the year 10-2, allowing 7 touchdown passes to Graham Fisher. The unfortunate thing here for Duke is Justin Tucker might have had his best game yet, and they still lost. Duke probably is still good enough to get an at-large bid, but with teams like Oregon, Georgia, and Clemson possibly ahead of them, it's no guarantee. This Duke team reminds me a lot of Houston last year, a team with a Heisman-esque quarterback, an elite #1 receiver, and a really, really bad defense. The last game we'll go through today is Maryland and Navy. With some of the other results that have already happened, Navy has already clinched their division, with both Clemson and Florida State losing today. So, congratulations, Navy, you're going to the conference championship game. This is still a must-win game for Navy. If they were to lose the conference championship game, they'd still want to get an at-large bid. And if they win, they want to get as high of a seed as possible. So this game is still really important for them. They would end up taking care of business 28-7, moving them up to 10-1 on the season. And of course, they had the big Army-Navy game next weekend, which is important for a number of reasons. If Navy wins that, they would improve to 11-1. A good win here for the Midshipmen, who are now number 6. As for Maryland, their first year back in the ACC ends up being pretty disappointing, as they finish with a record of 3-9. Not good. Let's take a look at some of the other results around the rest of the country. South Florida drops 59 on UCF. Good Lord. Looking at some of the other scores here, Baylor wins. They finish 10-2. Michigan State beats Penn State 56-46. A lot of offense. Washington with double-digit wins. They beat Washington State. Southern Miss with a solid win. They move up in the rankings. Middle Tennessee State back on the win column. They beat UConn by 20. And then looking at some of the other scores we talked about, the Cincinnati one, they're going up against Baylor in the conference championship game. And Cincinnati would have anyway, because Iowa State ended up losing this week. So it all works out for the Bearcats. Toledo won their game. They clinch their division. They'll go to the conference championship. Illinois loses to Northwestern. Yikes. Miami squeaks away from Boston College. TCU finishes the year 7-5, while Nebraska finishes 4-8. LSU finishes 2-10. Ouch, they might fire their second coach within the last 3 years. Looking down a little further now, Memphis with a solid win. Texas A&M wins. They finish the year 2-10. Central Michigan loses again. They finish 3-6 in conference. Ouch, that's not good. While Syracuse finishes not bowl eligible, Ole Miss upsets Mississippi State in the Egg Bowl, and Arizona beats Arizona State. So as we look at the polls, we've got a new number 1 team for the 3rd consecutive week. It's Florida, who jumps Alabama. Looking at some of the other notable movers, teams like Middle Tennessee State, Clemson, Baylor, and USC all jump up 2 spots. Duke drops all the way to 16. Florida State drops all the way to 14, with Stanford and UAB now ranked. Illinois and Mississippi State drop out. As for the Heisman watch, not a whole lot of movement other than Puma Whitlock and Aaron Ketchikan swapping spots, and Cedric Chapman moving up into the top 5. And then players of the week, those end up going to Stephen Brown of Washington and tight end Orlando Slaughter of Michigan State. So we've now got one more week to go. The only 2 teams in real playoff contention playing this week are Navy and Oklahoma. They both have non-conference games. So this means all of the major conferences have been decided. Let's take a look at what we're going to get in the conference championships before we take a look at Week 15. In the SEC, we've got the top 2 teams facing off, Florida and Alabama. The winner will probably be the number 1 overall seed in the playoff. Navy goes up against Virginia Tech in a dramatic ending for the ACC. Ohio State will go up against USC, who beat Notre Dame. Cincinnati will go up against Baylor in the Big 12. Washington and Cal will get a rematch of their epic Pac-12 championship game from a season ago. Middle Tennessee State has a chance to get back to the playoff for a 3rd straight year if a win over UAB. And then Bowling Green will face off against Toledo, who has the tiebreaker over Eastern Michigan and Northern Illinois. Some conferences don't have conference championships, like the Conference USA, Mountain West, and Sun Belt. A lot of the teams in those conferences still have games this week, so those conferences have not yet officially been decided. There are some interesting races in those conferences, but I'm really focused on the conferences who have conference championship games, particularly the important ones, like the Power 5 ones. So there are 2 games of importance this week. Army-Navy and Oklahoma State-Oklahoma. We're going to put our attention onto Army-Navy. I always like to watch this game and get like actual highlights just to sort of test out my sliders, and we're going to do that again this year. So we're going to get our first real look at Navy, which is pretty exciting because there's a good shot we'll be seeing these guys quite a bit. We're going to see them in the ACC Championship against Virginia Tech, and we're probably going to see them in the college football playoff. But Navy's got a tough test here. Army is no slouch. They are currently 5-6. They're fighting for bowl eligibility. The past 2 seasons, Navy was expected to beat Army, and both times Army won the game. So Army, being an even bigger underdog, again, has shown that they like being the underdog against their rivals Navy. So there's no reason to think Army can't make this a game and possibly win it. So I'm excited to see what Navy is ultimately going to show today, and if Army is going to put up a big fight against their rivals. Let's take a look at some of the team statistics. Amongst the major 8 ones, Navy is ranked first in 3 of them. Rushing offense, passing defense, and overall defensive yardage, while being 5th in points allowed per game at just 21. Navy's got one of the best defenses in the country. They've got a great rushing attack as well. In the pick'em, Navy ended up getting around 84% of the vote. On paper, they should win this game, but that's what we've said the last 2 seasons. And obviously, Navy did not win either of those games. It ended up being Army, with the game here being at the Lincoln Financial Field, home of the Philadelphia Eagles and home of the 2024 Army-Navy game. So Army would get the ball first. They would move down the field pretty nicely. Now in the red zone, looking to strike as on 3rd and 3. Quarterback Quandale Dingle would connect with running back Kyle Macklin, who would get it to the 1 on the halfback screen. Army would have some trouble punching it in, but on 3rd and goal, Kyle Macklin would score, and thus Army would strike first as they lead 7-0. So that's going to bring out the Navy offense. This is an old school triple option style offense. They have the #1 run game in the entire country, led by their dynamic young quarterback Chuck Burton, who breaks off a big gain of around 27, putting the midshipmen in the red zone. Burton is inconsistent as a passer, but dynamic with his legs. Navy would kick a field goal as it's now 7-3. In the second quarter, Army's moving the ball pretty well down the field here. 3rd and 4. Quandale Dingle under pressure connects with a nice pass over to Chris Preston, who puts the Black Knights in the red zone. And then on 2nd and goal, he would connect with Ricky Garrison for a score. And it's Army who leads early, 14-3. Navy's got to get some plays going. Here's a nice handoff up the middle. A huge run for Torian Wilson, the star running back, as he gets a big gain. Wilson is the all-time leading rusher and rushing touchdowns leader in the Navy program. Navy would once again not be able to score a touchdown. They'd have to settle for a kick. And so Army now leads 14-6. Let's go to the following Navy possession. We'll see if they can tie it here late in the first half, as it's a handoff up the middle from the big fullback, Caleb Tyree, who gets it to around the 15-yard line. It looks like the midshipmen are knocking on the door. They've struggled so far in the red zone today, but 3rd times would be the charm, as Chuck Burton would score. Navy would go for 2 and miss it, meaning Army still is the lead, 14-12. The Black Knights will get it back late in the first half with a 3rd and 9 as they look to possibly extend the lead. Quandale Dingle looks to throw it here on a screen. That's seemingly what Army has done throughout the game. They've ran a lot of screens. Is Joe Lombardi the play caller for this team? I don't know. They have a very non-aggressive offense. Navy would get it back, but it would be intercepted. A bad pass by Chuck Burton, and Army forces a huge turnover. Jeremy Harrison picks it off. Couple plays on the Army drive, and Dingle would be intercepted. So Navy forces a turnover and gets a pretty good return after the fact. So a nice turnover there by Roosevelt Peterson, and now Navy can take the lead here before halftime. On the goal line, 1st and goal, it's a pitch for one of the backup running backs, John Dorsey, and he will put Navy ahead. Through the first half, we've got ourselves a good one here in Philadelphia. 19-14, Navy leads. We'll see if the midshipmen will continue to show off the talent disparity in the second half and wipe these guys out, or can Army continue to play well? Navy starts at the ball. They would bring it all the way to the goal line, looking to make it a 2-score lead, as Burton would toss it to the senior Torian Wilson, and he fumbles the football. It's picked up by Brian Nichols, who's going to look to take it for a scoop and score with nobody in front of him. 30, 25, 20, 15, 10, 5, touchdown. Army has completely flipped the trajectory of this game on its side. Navy was about to be up by 2 scores. Now they're losing. Army would go for 2 and miss it, so it's 20-19 as Burton pitches it to the outside. It's John Dorsey who scores his 2nd touchdown of the game from 26 yards out. Navy would go for 2 and get it, so they're up by 7. A lot of going for 2 today. We've had some weird scores in this game. Following Navy possession, they're looking to finally take that 2-score lead. They would do so as Chuck Burton scores. Other than the fumble recovery touchdown, Navy has looked dominant here in the second half, really showing why they are in the ACC Championship, contending for the college football playoff. Army trails by 14, looking for a comeback, and that's a good start. Marcus Wheeler, the pro prospect at tight end, scores in the back of the end zone, making it a 7-point game. Good drive by Army. We'll see if their offense gets it back. Navy's moving the ball well in the red zone. Is on first down. It's a fumble. Torian Wilson tried to pitch it, and it's picked up by Army, and they're going to take it for another scoop and score to tie the game. Army has had 2 fumble recovery touchdowns in the second half. What are the odds of that? So we are now tied at 34 with not a lot of time left on the clock. 3rd and inches. Chuck Burton is pushed into the end zone for the potential go-ahead touchdown. Navy leads by 7. What an all-time game this has been. Army would get it back late. On 3rd and 9, they would get around 8 with Preston. So this is pretty much the game here. 4th and 1. If Navy gets a stop, they win and improve to 11 and 1. Dingle hands it off up the middle to Macklin, who converts. Kyle Macklin gets 3 to keep the drive going, but Army does not have the clock on their side. Not a lot of time left, around 20 seconds. Quandell Dingle on 3rd and goal, shoots it from the back of the end zone, and it's caught for a touchdown. Redmond Colt with the score, and we are tied up. So Navy's going to try pretty much for one final Hail Mary. If they don't score here, we're going to overtime. Burton, under pressure, heaves it up for the end zone, and it is caught by Barrett McCauley, who is tackled just a yard short of the end zone. What an unbelievable game we've got, and we're going overtime. Navy was 1 yard away from winning. Tails never fails, baby. Navy chooses tails. Navy wins the toss. Of course they do. Tails never fails. And Navy will start on defense. So Army's going to open up with the ball on 3rd and 14. Dingle looks for the end zone, and he is intercepted. Navy forces a big-time takeaway. The midshipmen can now position themselves to win the game. We'll see if they can do it. All they need is a field goal, although I'm sure they wouldn't mind a touchdown. 1st and goal. Navy has struggled in the red zone today. Pitch for Torian Wilson. Walk-off touchdown. Game over. Navy finally gets over the hump. They have not been able to beat Army in the first 2 seasons of this series, but they do it here. Navy wins 47-41 in overtime in an unbelievable game with 2 scoop and scores in the second half from Army. A Hail Mary 1 yard away from winning for Navy. Navy had more than doubled the amount of yards that Army did, yet this game went into overtime. Weird. We'll start with Army. Quandell Dingle was efficient, but 6.3 yards per completion is not it. I wish they were a little bit more aggressive throwing the football. Defensively, not great. I mean, they allowed 47 points, but they did have 2 defensive touchdowns. As for Navy, Chuck Burton was solid in the air. I think over half of his passing yards came on the Hail Mary, but still solid. They had 300-yard rushers. The team as a whole ran for, I think, close to 400 rushing yards. Probably over. Probably more like 450. Defensively, Navy was not very impressive. They had a few big takeaways, but nothing spectacular. I was expecting more. Looking at some of the other Week 15 games, Oklahoma, must-win game. They take care of business against Oklahoma State, and nobody else notable really played. So because of that, the top 25 will stay exactly the same. Navy and Oklahoma don't move up. Nobody else moves in. So it is literally the exact same as it was last week. The Heisman watch, also the exact same. I thought maybe Romeo Colucci would slide into the top 5. He probably should, but he doesn't. And then players of the week for Week 15, Lorenzo Slater of FIU, and New Mexico wide receiver B.B. Cronce. So that means the regular season is now done. We've got 7 more games before we decide who's in the college football playoff. These are our conference championship games. We'll be watching all of these in the next episode. I'm really excited to go over these games in depth and ultimately watch them. After the next episode, we will begin the voting process, not just for the college football playoff, but the Heisman Trophy and all the other big-time awards. That'll wrap up the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.